I want this strike to be the hardest strike we ever made. I want people to scream and cry over this strike.
Oh no!
And just say, how do I complete this strike on Grandmaster difficulty? And I'll be like, yes.
So, was it? No, it wasn't. But it definitely made some arguments for itself within the newer era of player power that we are currently in. Liminality released today in Grandmaster form, which is the final shape strike. Not a battleground, not a seasonal activity, not an episodic activity, is a true strike. My team had our first clear take about 30 minutes, but that's because I got launched into lava and I was completely unrevivable, so my teammates had to do the last chunk of boss damage on their own. So I actually did tier list a while back on the hardest GMs that we have ever experienced. I did it back in season 15. And back then I said stuff like Garden World and the Corrupted season 11 were among the hardest GMs that we have ever experienced. The next tier down was stuff like Tree of Probabilities and Hallowed Lair and Savathun's Song, Proving Grounds Season 13, Glassway Season 12, and I'm willing to include Lightblade Season 16 as well. I just obviously didn't include it because it wasn't out yet. The reason I'm not necessarily willing to say Liminality was harder than any of those is pretty much due to our power levels. Seasons 10, 11, 12 had some of the hardest GMs in the game because our character strength was pretty weak compared to where we are today, and thus the difficulty of a GM experience back then was much higher as a result. You had to be much more methodical. We didn't have the same tools for champion stuns, so your loadout was more restrictive. We were still on old subclasses like 2.0. This era was when Ursa Furiosa was like the god tier exotic meta. Like, that's where we were at back then, okay? So I never really thought Liminality would ever get to that point simply because we're just far too strong. But if we instead compare to stuff in the modern era, Lightfall era type stuff and beyond, then I do think it is tough compared to some of the things we have on offer today. If we compare this to this episode's Grandmaster offerings, I think arguments can be made to say that it is the hardest strike. But I don't know how fair that is to really say when its only real competition is PsyOps Battleground Cosmodrome, which, to be fair, has a pretty stressful boss section, even if you're just chilling in the back of the map, and the lead up to it can be a little annoying for some teams. Episode 1 probably has some of the easiest GMs in the game. Fallen Saber, The Disgraced, Devil's Lair, Warden of Nothing, Insight Terminus. If Glassway's boss was any weaker, Glassway would be on here too, because the rest of the strikes are really easy. Liminality is more tuned like a Battleground GM type experience, and I'm a pretty big fan of Battleground GMs because they're basically strikes, but they're tuned for the modern era of the game. The first big room just features a lot of different hive enemies, a lot of wizards, acolytes, some knights, cursed thrall, a few champions scattered throughout. It felt like it was non-stop for a couple minutes, but that's because my team was able to keep the pace pretty high with breaking loosened seals, and that's just going to spawn in more enemies. I don't want to say it was a huge struggle, but it is a little easy to get reckless here, especially in the build that I was using, which is one that I did a video on very recently, so check out that video when you're done. First time through, I'm probably playing in the back of the map a bit more if I'm not wanting to be as aggressive. I'm learning the spawns, stuff like that. Although the enemies did feel so frequent that it almost didn't even matter to learn spawn patterns. You should, but I know memorize spawn patterns isn't exactly the most thrilling piece of advice, even if it is the absolute most good advice that I have. Most good advice, the best advice that I have. The Ahamkara Skull rooms are actually somewhat difficult now. Their timer is not nearly as forgiving. The room to the left, if you hesitate for even a moment, or maybe you get an unlucky boop and you're thrown off course, you are probably going to die here because you were just too slow. The right side requires you to shoot 3 sets of floating eyes in order to escape now. So you gotta be quick with your aim in order to leave. Plus you got the platforming section as well while the lava's coming up. I'm happy to see that these aren't completely free objectives like they were in the campaign. Not that I was really expecting them to, but I think I underestimated this section a little bit. The town area is somewhat intense. It's got a lot of enemies that can shred you. All spawning from different sections of the arena, so don't go into the middle right away. This is where a void weapon is really going to come in handy because the majority of enemies, which are acolytes, have void shields. So the opportunity to just chain explode shields is here. Commemoration, Hammerhead, Graviton Lance, Collective Obligation, even some other like legendary primaries, you name it, it's probably good here because you're just going to chain kill stuff. The biggest issue were the Grim. They're very easy to lose track of. They have 100% line of sight on you basically all the time, and I would really, really suggest getting rid of them first before dealing with other enemies unless you have literally no choice. First couple times through, Well of Radiance did save us while we were learning, I'm not going to lie. The lava doesn't really come up as high as I thought it was going to. I thought we were going to be chased to the high ground like really, really aggressively. It didn't come that high, so that shouldn't be a huge deal unless you are on the lowest of low ground. Being up high does have its benefits, but generally speaking, stuff can still see you pretty easily, so don't be afraid to roam around if you find yourself in trouble, you want to find cover, you want to hide behind a building, something like that. I liked playing more towards the upper middle area when we finally did get established, but there are places to hide here if you need to retreat. Boss room gets a little dicey because of how many enemies end up spawning in and how spread out they can get. It's not just a singular wave of enemies, it's quite a lot, but Acolytes still have Void Shields, which makes them very easy to chain kill or chain disrupt at the very least. Knights have Solar Shields, that's a little more annoying, but it's, you know, you can deal with it. I would say don't let your guard down for a little while, especially because like the arena is a circle and there's not that many places to hide. Like there is some cover, but there's always some kind of side where they're going to be able to shoot you. So stay vigilant on the enemies because the boss is not that aggro for the first 2 chunks of their health meter. Like they hurt, don't get it twisted, that projectile hurts, but they're not really going to bum rush you or anything. So the only way that I feel like you can get one shot is if you're just not paying attention and the boss literally just comes up and melees you in the back or something like that. Or if you're weak and it hits you with a projectile. The first in-between phase is more of the same platforming stuff from earlier. Run to the exit, shoot the eyes. There are a few more waves of eyes to shoot, but the room is a giant sphere. Sorry, it's circle, so it shouldn't be too tough to manage. Keep in mind that the Ahamkara skulls eventually will send out a pulse wave, which does result in a knockback. So don't get knocked into lava, because there is a chance you will be unrevivable. You will get knocked in the lava, your ghost will be floating above the lava, and any attempts to revive you will result in instant death. Like, it just, don't die in the lava. That's like probably rule number 1. Don't die in the lava. Second phase, I think, is literally the same as the first phase. I think it's literally the same. Lots of ads, slow-moving boss. I would absolutely save ammo for the final phase, especially if you're on something like a rocket sidearm. I know they're very good, but rocket sidearms feel like they do nothing to this guy at all. They are not that good for the boss. You really need some precision weapons if you want to finish this up quickly. The second in-between phase summons a bunch of hive enemies to the area opposite where the boss will jump down. So like behind you, I guess, if you're kind of playing in the middle of the room facing, you know, where the boss is, along with a Lucent Hive wizard. I've heard that if you kill the wizard quickly, like a lot of stuff minus champions will potentially despawn, they'll go away. I didn't try it. I wouldn't say, don't quote me on it or nothing. Don't rely on it until it's absolutely confirmed in some way. Comment section maybe help me out here. This should be treated like the first or second damage phase, though, in terms of the enemy spawns. There's a lot. They're spread out. They hurt. It's a very similar group of enemies as well, so just take it pretty seriously. Final phase. The only difference is that the boss is loose, hyper aggressive, running around. It is no joke. And unlike Lightblade, there is only one floor to work with. So you gotta keep up the pace with running around. Enemies, same kind of enemies that are gonna continue to spawn in. They should be your priority while moving around the arena. I'm not gonna lie, this area does get pretty sus. We probably should have wiped here on one of our runs. Again, don't underestimate anything here, okay? Even if you gotta plink the final boss down with primary ammo, because eventually the ads will stop spawning, it is better to kill all the ads with your heavy ammo and plink down the final boss than it is to die to the enemies holding your heavy ammo. Overall, this is definitely not a walk in the park like what most normal strikes have become in the GM playlist. I would put it much closer on the slider towards Battlegrounds. It is a GM strike that I feel is much more tuned to the modern era, which I do really appreciate. Ow. But is it the hardest ever? No, it's not the hardest ever. But I appreciate that you tried. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.